Hello and welcome. My name is Zafar Iqbal, and you're watching the Mojo Story. Now, days after those horrific images surfaced of bodies striven in the streets of Bucha in Ukraine, the United Nations General Assembly will be voting on a draft resolution seeking to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, this is a move that has been initiated by the US. The United Nations General Assembly, by a two-thirds majority of members present and voting, may suspend the right of membership in the council of a member that commits systematic violations of human rights. Now, here in this case, the abstentions do not count. Now, we've been seeing a series of developments since this war was started by Russia in Ukraine. To discuss more on this, we're joined by an eminent panel, Dr. Manoj Joshi of the ORF, and Alexandra. She's also joining us. She's from the Center for Civil Liberties. Dr. Joshi, first to you, what do you make of this development?
This is part of the ongoing, the consequences of the Ukrainian invasion. I think the world is trying to react through the usage of the existing global system. But what it does presage is that, suspending a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council from the human rights body or a body of the United Nations is a very serious step. And it can have all kinds of consequences. I think you may recall that back in the, 1949-50, the erstwhile Soviet Union had boycotted the UN Security Council, and that had consequences, including the Korean War resolution, which was passed virtually unanimously. So I think we are seeing some kind of developments taking place whose consequences are not yet very clear.
Yes, Alexandra, if I can ask you the same thing, in 2011, it was Libya which was suspended when there was fighting going on between forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi and the other side. Now, after that, this has come to the fore now, voting which will be taking place on the question of Russia. What is the sense that you make out of this?
I think that for me as a human rights defender, it's very strange to see country which provide massive human rights violation inside against their own population, against Russian people, as well as provide atrocities, war crimes and crimes against humanity on the territory of Ukraine, to be a part of UN Council of Human Rights. It's undermine the efforts of international community to build and protect a system which can save human rights, which can save human lives. It ruins the reputation of UN itself. So Russia has to be excluded from membership of UN Council of Human Rights. And I hope that today, during the voting, the states will support this decision, because this is the only one. Yes, when Russia will be excluded, it couldn't stop war like immediately. But it will be a it will be a strong message to Russia's leadership that at least in 2022, international community stop to keep silence, as we see in previous times when Russia used chemical weapon against civilians in Syria, when Russia organized war crimes in Georgia, when Russia did the atrocities on their own territory during the war with Chechnya.
Ambassador at the UN has said, of course, he has acknowledged that Bucha was under Russian control, but he said, and I quote, not a single civilian suffered from any kind of violence. But the pictures tell a different story altogether. Alexandra?
We not rely upon pictures. We gathered testimonies of victims and witness of these war crimes, and they told us with details how they were beaten, how they see of people who were raped, how their relatives were killed. And we had the stories even before when the cities were liberated, because Russia's troops isolated this area, but some people were lucky to escape. Not all, unfortunately, because they don't allow civilians for safe evacuation, and they deliberately shelling on civilian car, and that's why you can see on these photos a lot of civilians' car which were shelled during they tried to escape from this area. And then when these areas were liberated, our mobile groups came to work on the ground, but not only our mobiles group. There are plenty of international journalists, and they can speak with locals directly. So it's very hard for Russia to pretend that they are not guilty, because a lot of people work on the ground. It's not Ukrainian voice; it's international voice. It's journalists from India, it's journalists from Switzerland, it's journalists from France. So they provide objective information what was going on during the Russian occupation on this territory.
And what is the sense that you get, after speaking to people and getting the details from the ground? What exactly is the situation there?
It was a terror against civilians because they not deliberately target only active people like head of villages. We know this story that a head of village Matyzhin, Olga Sukhenko, was kidnapped and tortured to death together with her husband and her son, and then they were buried in a common grave. And there is a picture which very widespread of how they were found. But they also targeted every locals which they want, without any distinctions. Is it active people or passive people? Can they provide peaceful resistance to occupation? Couldn't they provide peaceful resistance to occupation? So it was a massive terror with no even rational sense, just because they can do, because they can control, because they can rape and kill civilians. And I have one impression, not as a human rights defender, but as a human being, because look, I think if Bucha, which now shocked the whole world, have only 14,000 of people, what the hell expected us in Mariupol, where hundreds of thousands of civilians there?
Of course, it seems like a massacre that's taken place there, and as the time progresses, there could be more details that will be coming out from those areas, right?
Now Mariupol is isolated totally by Russian troops, and they try to occupy the city. They control some part of Mariupol, but in another part it's still going on resistance. And that's why they use this tactic of blockade the city. It's very cruel tactics, because they don't allow civilians to leave the city. And people in Mariupol for weeks are in basement, without food, without water, without electricity, without medical care. Men, women, children are dying. And they do it deliberately, because they want to stop resistance of locals. Because if they provide people who want to leave the city, it's provide more free hand for people who decided to stay and to fight for the freedom of this city. And that's why I said that it's very cruel tactics as a blockade, and it's prohibited by international humanitarian law, because international humanitarian law obliged Russia to open humanitarian corridor and to allow civilians to leave.
I know you have to leave our show. You're going to some other show as well. But one last question: that how do you foresee the situation developing over the next few days and weeks in those areas?
It's a very hard question for me, because the logic very clear that if we will not be able to show Putin a clear signal that he will pay a high price for the further invasion, the logic of the war, that this war crime will become more intense and intense. We see it from weeks to weeks. As a human rights defender who documented war crimes across the country. And this provides me a very sharp question. What I can do as a human rights defender, not only for documenting all these atrocities for future justice, because future justice is always delays in time, but what I can do as human rights defender, as human beings, in order to stop these atrocities, to prevent these war crimes to emerge, to save people. And this is much more challengeable question. And here we couldn't solve this question only by our hand, and we need support. That's why when I was in your show previously, I asked Indian people for support. And because now we in Ukraine, we are fighting for the values of democracy. Russia started this war in order to stop us on the way of democratic transformation. And it's not good to live in people in the world where some country decided what has to be done by another independent country. And if we will not be able to stop Putin in Ukraine, it's only a matter of time which next country will be a target.
Well, Alexandra, that's an important question that people are looking at India. How is India going to stand in this at this point in time? We know that India has abstained at least 11 occasions on procedural votes and draft resolutions in the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine. But Manoj Joshi, how do you see India going here on?
India has a long specific resolution criticizing a country for human rights violations. So that's a previous position. So it will be undoubtedly be difficult to vote in favor of a resolution to throw Russia out. I don't see the Indians doing that. While it has a long-standing technical stance, India will take a call, I think, based on political considerations. See, because a negative vote by India will be not difficult to explain to the Western capitals. Most of them have been trying to persuade New Delhi not to dilute the economic pressure on Moscow by increasing purchase of Russian fuel. Now, at the end of the previous UNGA vote on March 2nd and March 24th, Russia had commended countries who had voted against the resolution as well as those who had abstained. You see, this time Russia has made it clear that abstention or non-participation will be seen as an unfriendly act. So the Russians have already drawn certain red lines. And so India, but of course, India has taken note of the concerns of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on violations. The Indian statement also said that the Council should not take a political decision, and also noted that the credibility and legitimacy of the Council will be enhanced when the Council is seen to be dealing with similar situations in a similar manner, and not sacrificing concern for human rights at the altar of political expediency and strategic opportunism. That had been the Indian statement. So it is going to be a tough call for
Yes.
India.
Yes, India has, of course, unequivocally condemned the Bucha, incidents after those images came out. But the options for India are really narrowing because Russia making it very clear that even abstention is not an option for it. It will impact the bilateral relations, not just India specific, but it's told other countries as well.
See, India has called for an independent investigation. Now, the
Yeah.
thing is, what does that mean? Meaning, surely the UN Human Rights Council itself can be an independent investigation. Who is an independent investigation?
Yeah.
Now, India could not have said anything else because to reject the idea of an investigation again would have been a problem for India.
Yeah.
So I think the Indian policy of trying to balance issues is becoming more and more difficult, and
Yes.
and if more such instances are revealed, which I expect they will be revealed in the coming days and weeks, I think there will be a lot of pressure on New Delhi, especially building up, because part of it arises out of the media investigations into some of this stuff. So
Yes.
I definitely think that India is in a very difficult kind of a position.
India will be forced to take a stand if such images keep on coming and such developments keep on getting reported over the next days, few days and weeks. It will be very difficult to maintain that balancing act.
Yeah, that is true. But I think If India abstains, Russia gets a little bit angry. So it is possible that they have also privately told the Russians that look, there's a limit beyond which we cannot we cannot have a a pro-Russia neutrality. Neutrality may have to be neutrality. But as I said, there is still the question of investigation, because if you have seen instances, the charges that in Bucha the Ukrainian civilians were killed. There are also in the internet there are things where Russian prisoners of war are being shot. There have been some imagery of that. So, in war these things do happen. These things happen in almost every instances, and no country is above. No country has a good reputation on such matters. When wars break out, all countries commit violations. All countries have commit excesses. This is the fact. And this has been proved, whether we look at Afghanistan issue, the Iraq issue, you will find numerous instances that even countries which have a very good reputation, like Canada, had to charge their special forces with atrocities.
And if Russia is indeed suspended from the Human Rights Council, how do you see it? Its impact on the war itself. Does it put Russia on the back seat and force it to take a stand to go against the war, or it will only provoke it to intensify its actions in Ukraine?
See, I don't think. See, the UN Human Rights Council is well known. The Americans today are supporting this move in the UN Human Rights Council, but the Americans earlier have looked down on the council. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they pulled out of the council at some point. They are not great supporters of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, I personally think that the Russians will do whatever they have to do. I don't think they will bother about the votes in the United Nations. I don't think that's something which will modify their behavior in any way.
Yes. And also simultaneously, there are talks going on between Ukraine and Russia at some levels. Do you think that this will sort of, put an obstacle in those talks, because Russia cornered on one side by the international fora, at the same time, talks taking place between Ukraine and Russia at some level, the Ukrainian president again saying that they would want the talks to take place, although the war is happening on their land. It's not happening on the Russian land, but it's happening in Ukraine, and it's an invasion that was carried out by Russia.
I think that the Russians began with a particular plan. From whatever I can analyze, they thought that this would be a very quick victory for them. That hasn't happened. Now they are in plan B, plan C, plan D, and they finally reached a point where they are now focusing on the east. So we really don't know under what circumstances the Russians will terminate the war. And war termination is a very complex thing, in the sense that if you overdo it, you lose. Even if you win on the field, you may lose in the as far as the world is concerned. Meaning, in the minds of the people, in the global community, you may still lose. See, so this is a calculation which Russia has to make. Already now, with all this coming up, if the Russians had done what they did and pulled out in 5 or 10 days from Ukraine, they would have sent their message. And I think already the Ukrainian president had announced that we are willing to accept neutrality. The problem is that often with political leaders, there is always this temptation that, look, one more thing, let me achieve this, and then I will stop the war. Now, we don't know what that limit is. We don't know exactly where Putin mentally has set himself a goal that if I achieve this, then I'll stop the war. Because from what I can see right now is that the balance has been shifting pretty wildly.
And it was never clear that what exactly was Russian objective here. They sort
That is
of
what I'm saying. So not only
yeah,
that, the point is that it seems to me that the objective has been shifting and changing.
yeah. And over all these weeks, the international opinion has pretty much gone against Russia. It's not just that they would have factored all that when they started it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true.
Okay, at this point in time, we are also joined by Major General Dhruv Katoj.
But Zafar,
Well,
can I leave now? I have another engagement.
yes, yes, sure, sir, sure. Major General Dhruv Katoj, I was just talking to my guests on the show. Today, there is be a voting on a draft resolution which seeks to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, it's a move initiated by the US. What's your reading of this situation? Today, the voting will take place.
Thank you. Very frankly, I think India will abstain from this motion because basically, I think the United States and Western Europe always takes a moral stand when they are dealing with certain countries, but they do. We see an absence of any morality when they are dealing with another set of countries. So when we are looking at Ukraine, which forms part of the European domain, they have taken a very high moral stance, but they fail to exhibit any level of morality when we are looking at what has happened in West Asia or in some of the African countries. So in my view, I think firstly it is hypocritical to take a moral stand as far as this particular stage is concerned. Though, of course, I personally do not support any of the killings which have taken place. I find it reprehensible. But at the same time, to get Russia out of the Human Rights Commission, I think will be inflicting a self-goal upon us. If we have to follow this criteria rigidly, I'm afraid none of the Western countries, when you talk of US or NATO or China or any of these countries, will be part of the Human Rights Commission because each of them are violators of human rights. So where do we stop? I think this is something which has to be given much deeper consideration. And as far as India is concerned, while I personally, and I think the Indian government will also do the same, they will condemn the killings to put Russia out of the list or out of the group or the human rights group. I think will be a self-defeating exercise. Zafar.
But there's a context to this. You've seen those images emerging from Bucha, those bodies driven on the streets. It will be difficult to take that stand because now you got those pictures. You can see them on the screen. It may be difficult to do that balancing act.
Actually, I'm not very convinced about any of the pictures which come out from any source. Please remember that in Bucha, there were mercenaries from both sides operating. Who has killed whom? Nobody knows. And there is also a dispute as to when these pictures were taken. There is very concrete evidence to say, because the Americans are saying that it was taken in the month of March. There is very concrete evidence which has come out to state that they were taken on 1st of April, and that is based on scientific evidence. So who has taken those pictures, when were those pictures taken, and when did the killings take place, I think is still open to question, which is why I think we need to have a free and impartial probe by agencies outside NATO and outside Russia. So let there be a neutral agency which can come up and probe these killings, and I think the truth will come out.
Also, now that Russia has also said that an equidistant position, that's abstention or not participation, will be considered as an unfriendly gesture. So Russia is clearly telling the other countries to really side with it at this juncture when the voting takes place. So again, abstention may be difficult because now, even Russia is saying that that will be seen as an unfriendly gesture.
No, very frankly, I don't think India is going to be cowed down by both what the United States and NATO does, or any of the Western European countries do, or by what Russia does. India's stance throughout this dispute has been to charter its own policy. I'm not saying that India has been neutral. We have been looking after India's interest, and our interest is that this war must come to a close as early as possible. So long as the war comes to a close as early as possible and the dispute is resolved through diplomatic and political means, that has been India's consistent stand. Now, how will voting in this particular case, one way or the other, help towards achieving that goal? I don't think it is going to happen. So whether America says either you are with us or against us, or if Russia says either you are with us or against us, I really don't think that matters. I think India's stand has been very consistent. This is one. The second point I wish to bring out, in this particular case in Bucha, I think they have said about 400 plus civilians have been killed. It is very sad, and I condemn each one of those killings. Having said that, I would also like to tell you, when the Americans bombed a marriage party in Afghanistan and killed 70 people, not a whisper. When millions of people have been killed in Syria, in Syria and in Libya, not one word. Now, why is it different for the European countries, and why is it different for the Asian countries? Why is it then when people are getting killed in Africa, it doesn't really matter? Why is it when they get killed in Europe, it matters? Now, I think, the problem is that because we are not uniform in our condemnation, because we don't treat all people of the world equally, and then we expect to apply certain moral principles to a particular situation, and we don't wish to apply those principles to another situation. I think this is where the hypocrisy comes in. And unless we deal with the hypocrisy first and treat all human beings with the same level of compassion, I don't think this is going to work.
We told that perhaps the voting has started. If it has, then we can shift to that. Yeah, here it is.
Court adjourn the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly temporarily, and to authorize the President of the General Assembly to resume its meetings upon request from the member states. End of quote. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of the delegation to the document A/ES-11/6, which contains a joint letter dated 5th April 2022 from the permanent representatives of Antigua and Barbuda, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Georgia, Japan, Liberia, the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and the head of delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the General Assembly, requesting the resumption of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of the procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, document S/2014/136, to take action on the draft resolution issued as a document A/ES-11/L4. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L4.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates. Good morning, everyone. One early morning of April 1993, delegates to the United Nations had coffee, kissed their loved ones, and went to the quiet and comfortable United Nations headquarters to do business as usual. Perhaps as many of us have done this very morning. The same morning in early April 1993, Boutros Boutros-Ghali sent a special rapporteur to report on extrajudicial summary arbitrary executions in Rwanda. He reported a more robust United Nations response was needed. Critically, it found that the abuses could be precursors to genocide in 1993. Unfortunately, that was largely ignored by overstretched Secretariat of the United Nations. In early April, once again in April, in 1994, in the comfort of the United Nations headquarters, the Security Council received letters in which the Rwandan Patriotic Front reminded member states that, I quote, "When the institution of the United Nations was created after the Second World War, one of its fundamental objectives was to see to it that what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany would never happen again." End of quote. In 1994, Rwanda itself was a non-permanent member of the Security Council. This allowed the genocidal regime to influence other members of the Council with its view of the situation. As Russia's presence today in the Security Council allows her to spread lies almost daily. In April, again in April, this time 2006, in the docks of New York by the Hudson River, an ocean-sized state-of-the-art liner was launched. This magnificent liner was then docked on the shores of Lake Geneva. Beautiful as it is, far from being an ocean. We named this liner the Human Rights Council. The adoption of Resolution 60/251 was a culmination of 5 months of consultations and negotiations facilitated by President of the Assembly, Jan Eliasson, and Ambassador Arias of Panama and Ambassador Kumalo of South Africa. Let me remind you the words of Mr. Jan Eliasson, the President of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly before the adoption of the resolution. He said, and I quote, we have now reached a decisive moment, both for the promotion and protection of human rights and for effective multilateralism and the standing of the United Nations as a whole. As our leaders acknowledged in September 2005, the 3 pillars of the United Nations, development, peace and security, and human rights, are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. End of quote. Now the world has come to a crucial juncture. We witness that our liner is going through treacherous fogs towards deadly icebergs. It might seem that we should have named it the Titanic instead of the Human Rights Council. If not, we need to take an action today to save the Council from sinking. The composition of the Human Rights Council is as diverse as the world map, as this Assembly is. But this Council, unlike the Assembly, has been established for a specific purpose to promote and protect human rights around the world. And we are in a unique situation now when on the territory of another sovereign state, a member of the Human Rights Council commits horrific human rights violations and abuses that could be equated to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bucha and dozens of other Ukrainian cities and villages where thousands of peaceful residents have been killed, tortured, raped, abducted, and robbed by the Russian army serve as an example of how dramatically far the Russian Federation has gone from its initial declarations in the human rights domain. That is why this case is unique, and today's response is obvious and self-explanatory. Let me offer you another quote. Our topmost priority is to ensure all human rights and freedoms in their entirety, including political and civil rights and decent socio-economic and environmental living standards. I believe that these questions are not an internal matter of states, but rather their obligations under the UN Charter, the international covenants and conventions. We want to see this approach become a universal norm. End of quote. It is hard to believe that the above quotation belongs to the President of the Russian Federation. Another president, however, and other times. It was said by President Yeltsin in 1992 in his statement at the UN Security Council. We can only regret that the democratic aspirations of the peoples of Russia in early 90s have by Putin's regime been incrementally turned to their opposite. Aggression, hatred, and Soviet-style thinking and reflections, including in the area of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And now we hear completely different statements here in the United Nations from the Russian Federation. This week alone, we hear from the Russian ambassador that there is a warfare in Ukraine and civilians are killed in war. It's being said, as a matter of fact, this Monday, in cold blood and as an absolute normal course of action, also known as quote-unquote special operation. Shall we agree with the describing of killings as something normal? The only healthy answer should be no, in order to contribute to the maintenance of the UN's health and the health of its human rights mechanism. All of you received the Russian diplomatic note yesterday, in which our collective effort to preserve the credibility of the Human Rights Council was considered as an approach to preserve the, I quote, domination and total control in the world, end of quote, and human rights neo-colonial policy in international affairs. We have heard many times the same perverted logic of the aggressor attempting to present itself as a victim, while in fact doing exactly what it cries against in its note, killing citizens of neighboring country, trying to dominate, if it not colonize it. In reply to that, we call on Russia, when its rights of membership in the Human Rights Council are suspended, to return to responsible behavior by implementing the decisions of this Assembly and of Human Rights Council. If Russia expulses itself from the Council, it would be its own choice, and there will be no need to blame others. Suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council is not an option, but a duty. And let me quote how this duty is formulated in the operative paragraph 8 of Resolution 60/251, and I quote, "The General Assembly may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights, end of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an option. It is what the resolution prescribes. We view voting to suspend a state's Human Rights Council rights as a rare and extraordinary action. However, Russia's actions are beyond the pale. Russia is not only committing human rights violations, it is shaking the underpinnings of international peace and security. A draft resolution on the matter under A/ES 11/L4 is a result of the collective effort of a cross-regional group of 24 states that represent all regions. It has been co-sponsored so far by more than 50 UN member states. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Let me now once again refer to the commemoration of one of the darkest pages in recent history, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. On this day of grievances and bearing its own tragedy of thousands of Ukrainians killed by the Russian invaders, Ukraine stands together with Rwanda and calls to reaffirm our pledge to never forget and to never allow the recurrence of genocide, which was a result of the international community's indifference. To those of you who, for this or another reason, opts today to keep being a bystander, to abstain, let me quote Elie Wiesel addressing President Clinton in 1999, talking about the perils of indifference. Indifference elicits no response. Indifference is not a response. Indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. And therefore, indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. End of quote. The genocide in Rwanda was largely due to the indifference of the world's community. When the UN did not respond to warnings in the UN Security Council and in General Assembly a year before the tragedy that we commemorate exactly on this day, on the 7th of April. Today, in the case of Ukraine, it's not even a year, because the tragedy is unfolding right now before our eyes. In a couple of minutes, you will have a chance to prove that you are not an indifferent bystander. All you need to do is to press the yes button and to save the Human Rights Council and many lives around the world and in Ukraine. On the other hand, pressing no means pulling a trigger and means a red dot on the screen. Red as the blood of the innocent lives lost. And this image of the red bloody dots on this screen will stay with you and all of us as long as memory does not fail us. Think about it. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider 11/L4. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's not the time or the place for theatrics or these kinds of extremely theatrical performances like the one presented by Ukraine. In fact, the draft resolution we're considering today has no relationship to the human rights situation. On the note, today is an attempt by the United States to maintain its dominant position and total control, to continue its attempt at human rights colonialism in international relations. Part of member states are already subordinates. Those who wish to conduct an independent foreign policy is an attempt to kind of move them to the periphery of international relations. Today, we're seeing how, through the efforts of a small group of states, the human rights architecture there's a crack that's appeared in that architecture, and it was decades in the making. And the Secretary General stated that the possible exclusion of Russian Federation from the Human Rights Council could be a dangerous precedent. And as practice has shown, Western approaches in dealing with acute human rights problems in certain countries have not really been successful. Not a single conflict was resolved. It was only exacerbated. In many, this was due to the use by Western countries the use of sanctions and military intervention, whereas Russia, throughout its membership in the Commission and the Human Rights Council, has consistently defended the principle of cooperation based on mutual respect and an equal status as one of the main foundations of the human rights architecture. Our priority has always been to strengthen constructive dialogue involving all interested sides in the process of collective development and adoption of decisions in defending and promoting human rights. We reject the untruthful allegations against us based on staged events and widely circulated fakes. Mr. President, based on everything I've said, we would like to put this draft resolution to a vote and call on all those present here to really consider your decision and to vote against the attempt by Western countries and their allies to destroy the existing human rights architecture. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I'll now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
The Chair, Kazakhstan closely follows the situation in Ukraine with particular concern and expresses its condolences to the families of those who were killed and wish speedy recovery for those injured during hostilities. We call on all the parties to speedily terminate hostilities and to search for compromises aimed at establishing peace. We also adhere to the position that there is no alternative to a peaceful solution on the problem based on the principles of international law and the UN Charter. Humanitarian situation in Ukraine is dire and needs constant attention, and Kazakhstan has already provided Ukraine with humanitarian aid, sending 3 planes with over 50 tons of medicine and essential goods. Regarding the draft resolution on the suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council, we would like to note the following. First of all, in our opinion, the adoption of this resolution will not contribute to the settlement of the conflict. At the moment, it is extremely important not to undermine the negotiation process. In the current situation, it is necessary for all of us to use diplomatic efforts at all international forums, including Human Rights Council, in order to find ways to resolve the problem as soon as possible. Secondly, according to the paragraph 8 of the resolution on the establishment of Human Rights Council, membership of the Council can be suspended in case of gross and systematic violation of human rights. To establish that case, we need to have results of a transparent, unbiased, and professional investigation. In this regard, we believe that the consideration of today's resolution in the General Assembly must be preceded by a comprehensive investigation of human rights violation in Ukraine, carried out under the framework of relevant international mechanisms. We believe that only after receiving concrete conclusions and reliable information, the General Assembly may consider this issue. In the light of the above mentioned, today we will have to vote against this draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, as a founding member of the United Nations, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is committed to the purposes and principles embodied in the charter of our organization and to the norms of international law. We believe that the promotion and protection of human rights must be addressed in a just and constructive manner on the basis of dialogue and cooperation in accordance with the principles of impartiality, objectivity, transparency, non-selectivity, non-politicization, and non-confrontation. Human rights should not be used in order to attack sovereign states, since that undermines the universal system of human rights, which is to guarantee the universality and the enjoyment of these rights and fundamental freedoms for everyone without distinction or discrimination. A month ago in this assembly, we insisted on the need that the United Nations have a central role in facilitating the peaceful solutions of conflicts through dialogue and political negotiation. We regret today that the road has taken of escalating tensions and that divisions have increased among members of the United Nations. That is the wrong path. We alert the world as to the real and clear danger that in this situation in the region of Eastern Europe may continue in time, creating consequences which it will take generations to overcome. We warn about the expansive effects around the world, especially affecting the living conditions of the more vulnerable groups in every country, where hundreds of millions of individuals are today suffering the consequences of the increase in the cost of food, electricity, transportation. We also warn about the start of a new arms race, which threatens to turn toward war resources which should be used for development and for fighting poverty. This is a terrible situation, but the world is facing an even greater danger. We view with alarm that there are shocks between blocs and this will lead to a worldwide conflict between nuclear powers, which will destroy mankind as we know it today. It is our obligation to reduce tensions and to strengthen all options which allow for regulating conflicts and peaceful settlements. Mr. President, unfortunately, the draft resolution presented today is an example of the politicization of human rights. The draft tries to expel from the human rights system the Russian Federation, a country which is an essential part of the solution of the crisis in the Eastern European region. Without the Russian Federation, there is no possible peace agreement in Europe. A peace without Russia is a mirage. They may think that the time has come for a definitive victory and a unipolar power. If this draft is approved, it will affect current negotiations being carried out between the parties and will push us deliberately toward a more acute phase of the conflict, which will be longer and hard to resolve. Another immediate result of adopting the resolution will be a historical break in the best instrument created to defend human rights, which is the Human Rights Council. Its credibility, its function, and its mandate will be affected. We will be creating a systemic crisis of confidence, which will affect the United Nations as the universal organization which can resolve regional and global crises and work toward peace. In view of the above, the Republic of Venezuela categorically rejects attempts to suspend the Russian Federation as an elected member of the Human Rights Council and calls on the responsible members of the international community to vote against the draft resolution. Thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
President, my delegation expressed deep concern to current development of political situation in Ukraine. Also, we are very concerned that some countries continue to push confrontation and distrust among member states instead of giving priority to ease tension and seek political and peaceful solution to resolve current crisis in Ukraine. We reject any politically motivated initiative, lack of objectivity, impartiality, and transparency. The alleged accusation of the cruel atrocity against the civil population in Ukraine, including a relevant report and images of the civilian deaths in Bucha, have not surely verified and proved based on the real fact and objective evidence. Prior to considering the draft resolution before us, the independent investigation must be made, and for this, sufficient time and efforts are required. However, some member states are acting and moving very recklessly for their political goals by submitting such draft resolution. Such political and unilateral action do not help to solve the problem at all. We take note of the efforts of the Russian Federation to address the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. The draft resolution is nothing but another example of the product of the political confrontation aiming at tarnishing one member state at the UN stage. For this reason, my delegation against draft resolutions contain document A/ES-11/L4. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has on a number of occasions expressed its principled position with regard to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, including during the adoption of the two previous resolutions of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation would like to underline once again the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and for the full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. Iran remains deeply concerned about the continuous deterioration of the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, which has sparked significant alarm in the international community. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and emphasize the importance of complying with international humanitarian law by all parties. We repeat our call for unimpeded humanitarian access to all areas of the armed conflict in Ukraine. The humanitarian needs of the affected population must be addressed immediately, and the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to the people in need must be facilitated. The international community should encourage and support continued direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine until peace is restored. The Islamic Republic of Iran once again calls for the escalation of tensions in the current conflict and an urgent and lasting solution to this crisis through dialogue. Mr. President, we consider the text of the resolution before the General Assembly contained in document L3 as politically driven, which undermines the impartiality of our organization. My government attaches great importance to the promotion and protection of human rights. However, we are against the exploitation of UN human rights machinery for political ends, which contravenes the principles of universality, non-selectivity, and objectivity in addressing human rights issues. We have always maintained that human rights should not be undermined by short-sighted political considerations. We stress that the work of the Human Rights Council should be performed in a non-confrontational and non-politicized manner, and membership in this body should not be politicized. We would like to reiterate our position on the centrality of the principles of objectivity, dialogue, and cooperation towards the protection and promotion of all human rights based on a non-selective and non-politicized approach. We are of the view that the exploitation of paragraph 8 of UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251 deepens confrontation and attenuates constructive dialogue between countries. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation will vote against the draft resolution contained in document L4. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, once again, this important international forum witnesses the exploitation of human rights in the service of political interests of some countries and the creation of polarization and politicization targeting the Russian Federation on the pretext of dealing with humanitarian issues in the Ukraine. My delegation stresses the importance of guaranteeing and respecting human rights and the importance of providing necessary humanitarian assistance to all crisis areas. Yet, at the same time, we reject any politicization of humanitarian issues and stress the importance of adopting the principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-discrimination in human rights issues. Mr. President, this coordinated Western move to denounce the Russian Federation has no relation to human rights in the Ukraine or anywhere else. Rather, it is an effort by Western countries to impose their hegemony and control over the world through besieging Russia and its punishment for its independent foreign policy. When the United States of America and its allies destroyed the Syrian city of al-Raqqa and killed thousands of innocent people there, we did not see such international media and political mobilization to expose the perpetrators of human rights violations. General Assembly Resolution 60/251, establishing the Human Rights Council, stressed that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interlinked, and intertwined, and that they should be treated in a just and equitable way on the same footing and with the same degree of concern. However, the practice that we have seen since the establishment of that council until now proves the adoption by certain Western countries of politicization, selectivity, and double standards in dealing with human rights issues. They focus on the situations of certain countries in a manner that serves their political purposes. At the same time, they disregard other situations where grave human rights violations, systemic and grave human rights violations, were perpetrated in the full sound and sight of the world. And what the Palestinian people has been exposed to for decades at the hands of the Israeli occupation forces is the best proof of that. Another example is on the hypocrisy of those states is their disregard for the safety, security, and protection of civilians, including women and children in Donbass, who have been shelled and who have been attacked for years. We haven't seen such a move. At the same time, the invocation of the pretext of paragraph 8 of the resolution establishing the Human Rights Council is a major source of concern, since we have not seen any evidence to base such talk about grave violations of human rights. What is the credibility of the sources of such information? What are the impartial international mechanisms that were providing such information or proving their perpetration? The launching of accusations and the spreading of such accusations through misleading media and the photographs and videos whose sources and places are unknown, and their spreading through open sources cannot be basis for General Assembly action on the issue. As in the Syrian situation, Security Council and General Assembly meetings are always preceded with theatrical provocations, such as we witness in the Ukraine, to justify decisions planned by Western and hostile countries in the name of international legitimacy. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today involves a serious case of hostility and a clear example of the adoption of exclusion, of which we have warned. The suspension of the membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council will have an adverse effect on its balance, its universality, and the effectiveness of its role. Such suspension will enhance the hegemony of a group of Western countries on this important body. They will impose their vision and their criteria for human rights, and which will be used as a tool of political pressure and the targeting of certain countries. To be more frank and transparent, we believe that such practices represent a threat to the existence of the United Nations organization itself. Therefore, and proceeding from our firm and principled position in rejecting all attempts to politicize human rights, we will vote against the resolution before us, and we urge other delegations to be aware of the dangers of embracing these efforts at confrontation, isolation, and hostility. We call for the rejection of double standards and to keep human rights issues away from all political considerations. If we want the United Nations to continue and survive, we should all say no to such resolutions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente, Cuba ha abogado.
Mr. President, Cuba has always advocated for and worked toward a human rights council capable of facing the challenges of the international community in this area. No country is exempt. We defend the objectivity, impartiality, and transparency in the work of that body. Its procedures and mechanisms should work on the basis of true information. The use of the clause on suspension of membership in the Council will not favor finding a peaceful, lasting, and negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine. It will not promote the dialogue and understanding which should be prevalent in human rights issues. Only a few days after concluding a regular session of the Human Rights Council, that body was not even given the opportunity to state its position. Mr. President, since the start of the negotiating process on the building of the new council that would follow the Human Rights Commission, Cuba opposed the clause on suspension of membership, given the serious risk that it could be used by specific countries which favor a double standard, selectivity, and politicization of human rights issues. That clause can be activated with the support of only 2/3 of those present and voting. Therefore, abstentions do not count, and there's not even a minimum established of votes required for approving suspension. To be elected a member of the Human Rights Council, a country needs to obtain as a minimum in a secret ballot the support of the majority of the members of the United Nations, that is to say, at least 97 votes. Thus, the rights of a member of the Council can be suspended by the will of a number of states lower than the number of states which granted those rights. The Russian Federation, which was elected as a member of the Human Rights Council in 2020 with 158 votes, could be suspended today with by a lower number of votes. That suspension mechanism, which has no parallel in any other body of the United Nations, could be easily used selectively. It is Russia today, but tomorrow it could be any of our countries, especially nations of the South, which do not support the interests of domination and which firmly defend their independence. It was not by chance that the more enthusiastic promoters of the suspension clause, when negotiating the new Human Rights Council, were developed nations with a clear trend to accuse countries of the South which do not follow their alleged models of democracy while remaining silent in the case of flagrant violations in Western countries. Not everyone in this hall share our concerns about the suspension mechanism. They know that the victims of its selective use will always be others. Could this assembly someday adopt a resolution suspending the membership of the United States in the Human Rights Council? Just to give one example. We all know that that has not happened, nor will it, despite its flagrant and massive violations of human rights as a result of invasions and wars against sovereign states, given its geopolitical interests. They have caused the deaths of hundreds of millions of civilians which they term collateral damage. There have been millions of displaced people and destruction throughout our planet, but this assembly has never suspended any of its rights. We also all know that the suspension clause will not be used against the state that has imposed against Cuba for over 60 years a criminal economic trade and financial blockade, which no doubt constitutes the longest and most flagrant and systematic violation of human rights of an entire people and an example of genocide against a country. It is ironic to note that the country which opposed the establishment of the Human Rights Council and requested in this same hall a vote against the resolution establishing it is the same one that has conveniently now activated, as it did in 2011, one of the most controversial clauses. Mr. President, Cuba will will be consistent with the reservations when in 2006 resolution 60/251 establishing the Human Rights Council and 65/265 of 2011 on the suspension of the rights of Libya. Adoption of the draft resolution we are considering today will establish a dangerous additional precedent, especially for the South. It is not sufficient to impose resolutions against selective countries and mandates. Now they are trying to take a new step toward legitimizing selectivity and establishing a human rights council, which is increasingly at the service of a certain number of countries, as was the case with the discredited Human Rights Commission. For all of these reasons, the Cuban delegation will vote against the draft resolution contained in document L4. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, just as the rest of the international community, Senegal is profoundly concerned by the terrible cost of the war in Ukraine, which has already led to thousands of deaths, refugees, and IDPs. To this somber picture can be added allegations of severe violations of human rights. Everywhere and throughout history, war is a failure of humanity. Senegal is in favor of peace in Ukraine. Senegal is also in favor of peace in Ukraine because our countries are collateral victims of this global crisis due to its severe consequences, particularly serious for our economies and our people. Senegal is for de-escalation and for the immediate stoppage of hostilities in Ukraine and for negotiations in order to reach a peaceful and lasting solution to the crisis. This is the essence of the communique published on the 24th of February 2022 by His Excellency President Macky Sall in his capacity as the current President of the African Union. This is a communique that calls, and I quote, for the imperative respect of international law, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, end of quote. This is also the purpose of Senegal's support for Resolution 11/2 of the special session of the General Assembly on the 24th of March of this year on the humanitarian consequences of the war in Ukraine. It's also the what's behind our vote in favor of Resolution 49/1 of the Human Rights Council of the 4th of March of this year on the human rights situation in Ukraine, and in particular establishing a international commission of inquiry on the allegation of violations of human rights in the country as a result of the war. We believe that it is the publication of the conclusions of this commission that will give us a full overview of the nature and the scope of the violations. This overview will therefore give us the exact type of sanctions that should be envisaged. Now, this resolution decides on sanction measures before the inquiry commission that we've established delivers its outcome. So it anticipates on the work of this commission. Bearing in mind all these considerations, Senegal will abstain on voting from this text to be consistent with the resolution of the Human Rights Council of the 4th of March, setting up an international commission of inquiry on the human rights violations in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Senegal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa is deeply concerned about the continuing conflict in Ukraine, the loss of lives, and the deteriorating humanitarian situation. We reiterate our view that as a matter of urgency, there must be a cessation of hostilities, which would be the first step in a comprehensive response to the humanitarian crisis. South Africa stresses once again that dialogue, mediation, and diplomacy is the only path to end the current conflict. Wars end when dialogues begin, and wars endure when there is no dialogue. In this regard, we welcome the efforts by Ukraine and Russia to hold talks without preconditions. South Africa expresses the hope that both parties will use diplomacy to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine, leading to a durable political and security situation. We maintain that all parties have much to gain from a negotiated outcome and much to lose from unnecessary and violent conflict. The General Assembly must therefore encourage mediation and dialogue and adopt constructive outcomes leading to that. Mr. President, South Africa is deeply concerned at the reports of civilian casualties in Ukraine. As the international community, we cannot be indifferent to the killing and suffering of civilians. The humanitarian crisis that has resulted from the ongoing military operations must be addressed, and there must be an urgent opening of humanitarian corridors and the provision of aid to the civilian population, which, as usual, bears the brunt of the suffering when violent confrontation breaks out. All parties to the conflict must comply with international human rights and humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, and must respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states in keeping with the UN Charter. Mr. President, on 4th March 2022, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution authorizing the establishment of an international commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international law and related crimes in Ukraine. The commission has not yet commenced its work, and we await its findings on the allegations of gross violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. South Africa is of the firm belief that the tabling of the resolution that we will consider today is premature and prejudges the outcomes of the Commission of Inquiry. We must allow the Commission to urgently undertake its mandate and report to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly on its outcomes. It is also imperative that all parties to the conflict must allow the Commission to perform its duties without any hindrance and interference. Mr. President, we recall Resolution 60251, which is the basis of the resolution before us and which established the Human Rights Council, also recognizes inter alia, I quote, the importance of ensuring universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization, close quote. Unfortunately, the resolution that we are considering today will further divide and polarize the matter and the General Assembly itself without following due process. South Africa maintains that in considering the suspension of a member of the Human Rights Council, we must be consistent and not selective, as this would undermine the credibility of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. For these reasons, South Africa will abstain on the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Mr. President, Egypt does not view the draft resolution before us as a resolution related to the situation in the Ukraine, the principle of non-use of force in relations amongst nations. We rather are concerned of the functions and mandates of United Nations bodies. Our principal position rejects the current tendency, since it undermines the purposes for which the organization, its bodies, and agencies were established, as well as its credibility and multilateral work. Egypt considers that what we are doing today in considering the draft resolution represents a serious crossroads for the United Nations in its entire existence. The organization's respect for its charter, its rules of procedure, and its methods of work led the international community to rely on it in all international issues based on rules and regulations that are applied in the conduct of international relations with a view to preserving international peace and security that are in danger at this moment. The current draft resolution undermines the methods of work of the organization that have enjoyed the trust of the international community and threatens to undermine the credibility of the United Nations and its organizations, leading to further negative repercussions on the organization's ability to fulfill its role in accordance with its charter and as it has done for 75 years. Egypt is does not feel comfortable with double standards and partiality. Many times before, such resolutions were not adopted in cases of human rights violations that are not so far back in time. We are concerned with the violations of human rights and the obligations of all states in this regard, and we believe that such serious violations should be dealt with decisively in accordance with the United Nations rules and procedures in an adequate manner. Based on all of this, Egypt does not believe that the draft resolution is being proposed at the right moment, and we warn of it. Thank you.
thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, we are deeply concerned about allegations of gross violations of human rights and humanitarian law in Ukraine, including recent reports coming from the region of Bucha. The images of extreme violence against civilians and the high number of deaths, many of them with signs of torture and ill treatment, are profoundly disturbing. Our deep sympathy goes to all victims and their families. The Human Rights Council created last month a commission of inquiry with a mandate to establish the facts and circumstances that may amount to violations and abuses of human rights and of humanitarian law in Ukraine. We call on all parties to cooperate with the Commission so that it can fulfill its mandate and provide us with an unbiased and precise information on the situation on the ground. Brazil has decided to abstain in today's vote, as it believes the Commission of Inquiry should be allowed to complete its independent investigation so that responsibilities can be ascertained. Only then would this General Assembly be in a position to better assess and take a responsible and informed decision on the status of Russia in the Council. We must at all costs avoid repeating the mistakes of the old Commission on Human Rights, particularly concerning politicization, double standards, and selectivity, which had been the main flaw of the previous human rights system and the object of well-founded criticism of its work. The Human Rights Council should be guided by the imperative of inclusive dialogue as the main instrument for cooperation, sustainable solutions, and peace. Mr. President, Brazil is fully committed to finding ways to an immediate cessation of hostilities and to promoting a real dialogue conducive to a peaceful and sustainable solution. Ensuring respect for human rights and humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are the objectives that should unite rather than divide us. There is no alternative to a negotiated solution and to a constructive and balanced approach aimed at preserving spaces of dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now wish to invite the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the Ukraine issue, China always believes that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, should be respected, that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be upheld, that the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and that all efforts conducive to a peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. Putting an early end to the fight is the urgent expectation of the international community. It is also what China is striving for. China supports all initiatives and measures that will help ease the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We call on the parties concerned to respect international humanitarian law and take concrete actions to ensure the safety of civilians and protect the basic rights and humanitarian needs of women, children, and other vulnerable groups. The reports and images of civilian deaths in Bucha are disturbing. The relevant circumstances and specific causes of the incident must be verified and established. Any accusations should be based on facts. Before a full picture is clear, all sides should exercise restraint and avoid unfounded accusations. Mr. President, dialogue and negotiation is the only way out of the Ukraine crisis. China always believes that the international community should remain rational, strengthen unity, and do more to facilitate dialogue and negotiation and political settlement. It should not set up obstacles or add resistance, let alone adding fuel to the fire to aggravate confrontations. We regret to see that the conflict has caused civilian casualties and massive displacements. And the all-dimensional indiscriminate sanctions without a bottom line have brought serious negative impact on the post-pandemic recovery, creating new and complex problems, reversing hard-won development gains, and making the realization of the 2030 agenda even more difficult. People around the world, especially those in developing countries, have to bear the soaring oil and food prices. Life amid the pandemic has become even more difficult, and the rights of women and children even more difficult to be protected. Developing countries are not parties to the conflict, yet they are forced to get involved in this geopolitical competition and great power rivalry. This is unfair. Some individual countries, while talking loudly about peace, are obsessed with creating bloc confrontations, including provoking tensions in the Asia-Pacific region. This self-conflicting and self-serving practice is very dangerous and worrying and should be resolutely rejected. Mr. President, China always calls for promoting human rights through constructive dialogues and cooperation on the basis of equality and mutual respect. At the same time, we firmly oppose the politicization or instrumentalization of human rights issues, oppose the selective and confrontational approaches, as well as double standards on human rights issues, and oppose exerting pressure onto other countries in the name of human rights. Those are also important elements contained in General Assembly Resolution 60/25, which set up the Human Rights Council. The draft resolution before us will deprive a country's legitimate membership in the Human Rights Council. Such an important matter must be handled with the utmost delicacy, based on facts, with calmness, objectivity, and reason based on facts and truth. Nevertheless, this draft resolution was not drafted in an open and transparent manner, nor did it follow the tradition of holding consultations with the entire membership to heed the broadest opinions. Under these circumstances, such a hasty move at the General Assembly, which forces countries to choose sides, will aggravate the division among member states and intensify the confrontation between the parties concerned. It is like adding fuel to the fire, which is not conducive to the de-escalation of conflicts and even less so to advance in the peace talks. Dealing with the membership of the Human Rights Council is such a way will set new dangerous precedent, further intensify confrontation in the field of human rights, bringing a greater impact on the UN governance system and produce serious consequences. Therefore, China will have to vote against this draft resolution. China calls on all parties to work together in the same direction so as to create opportunities for peace and prospects for negotiation. China will continue to hold an objective and impartial position and play its responsible and constructive role in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, Mexico has been clear and categorical in condemning the invasion by Russia against Ukraine, since it violates international law, the Charter of the United Nations, and the constitutional principles of our foreign policy. We have also condemned attacks against the civilian population and its infrastructure. We have promoted everything which facilitates access to humanitarian assistance, and we have joined those voices which call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. Recent reports about the situation in Ukraine show us that we are facing a probable commission of serious violations of international law and the international law of human rights and of humanitarian international law. Mexico has thus clearly backed the Secretary General's call to conduct impartial investigations which may allow identifying those responsible and have effective accountability. My country also supported the adoption of Resolution 49/1 of the Human Rights Council to establish an independent commission of inquiry in order to investigate all of the alleged abuses and violations of human rights and anything which could violate humanitarian international law flowing from Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Mexico also follows attentively the process of an inquiry of the International Criminal Court of alleged international crimes committed in Ukraine and clearly supports the work done by the prosecutor to establish and clarify the facts. We are following the development of the case brought before the International Court of Justice, and we reiterate its call to comply with the recent provisional measures for an immediate cessation of hostilities. These are judicial and quasi-judicial processes which are underway, but which have not yet, in legal terms, classified the situations under consideration. We must be consistent. We must support them until they reach their ultimate conclusions and examine them rigorously. Whether Russia is a member of the Human Rights Council or not is not a factor which exempts it from obligations under international law or which imposes obligations. The central point here should be to bring to justice those responsible, not to suspend a state from membership in a subsidiary body of this assembly, in which all member states, without exception, must be accountable under the same rules and the same criteria. Mexico is in favor of accountability being regularly practiced throughout the United Nations system. We do need more transparency, but to that end, we also need more cooperation, more dialogue, and better practices. Multilateral structures are strengthened through inclusion, not through exclusion. To exclude, to suspend is not the solution. Multilateralism will be strengthened to the extent that it is able to maintain its inclusiveness. Prior resolutions of this assembly, which we have supported with conviction, condemn the Russian invasion, call for a clear cessation of hostilities, urge the unrestricted access to humanitarian assistance, and advocate for a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Mexico has stated its position explicitly with regard to Russia's military aggression against Ukraine through its statements in the Security Council and in this General Assembly, as well as in the votes taken in both bodies since the beginning of the conflict. In view of the above, Mexico will abstain from supporting the draft resolution which suspends Russia from membership in the Human Rights Council. Mexico is convinced that even in the midst of the war, all channels should be maintained for dialogue with the authorities of the Russian Federation, not only so that they cooperate with all the mechanisms which are part of the universal system of protection of human rights, but also to insist on the urgent need to find in dialogue the diplomatic solution which restores peace in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to start my intervention by paying tribute to the brutal war that is taking place in Ukraine, caused by an aggression that violated international law, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter. The tragic images of Bucha that came to our homes last week moved us tremendously. We condemn the invasion of Ukraine. The decision that we are discussing is a decision that my country would have never wanted to discuss. We are fully in favor of multilateralism. The multilateral system is a home for everyone. However, to be a member of the Human Rights Council involves certain requirements, including conduct consistent with the promotion and protection of human rights everywhere. As member states of this assembly adopted a relevant resolution which states that the members of the Human Rights Council must follow the strict standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. That same resolution in paragraph 8 entrusts to this assembly the responsibility of suspending a member state from the council when that state does not comply with the strict norms of protecting and promoting human rights. Our responsibility to human rights, rather than a specific country or Russia or Ukraine, our responsibilities to human rights, and the suspension of the Russian Federation from the Human Rights Council in this case, we're talking about a state that is violating the rights of a third state, Ukraine. And this is a result of an unacceptable aggression and invasion that is contravenes international law. This is why our delegation will vote in favor of the resolution L.4, which suspends the membership of Russia from the Human Rights Council. Chile once again reiterates its appeal to all parties to continue negotiations and urges for an immediate and peaceful resolution of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine through a political dialogue, negotiations through peaceful means in conformity with international law. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Mr. President, Belarus is categorically against the draft resolution under consideration. The introduction of this draft is motivated by exclusively political interests aimed at demonizing the Russian Federation and attempting to isolate it in international organizations. Such ideas lead to upsetting the equilibrium of the entire system of international cooperation, which is based on the UN Charter. And it could have a long-term negative impact, even leading to the destruction of the UN as a whole. In essence, today's proposal to exclude Russia is a direct contribution to destroying the Human Rights Council itself and in consolidating the destruction of the system of upholding human rights under the UN auspices, which has been expressed over the past few weeks in attitudes of racism, xenophobia, and other manifestations of discrimination based on language, culture, religion, or other characteristics that we're seeing in Western countries. It's important to focus not on short-term immediate tasks under the influence of emotions, but rather to think about the long-term prospects of resolving conflict situations and about the post-conflict world order. The resolution that is being proposed, just like other steps on restricting the participation of Russia in international organizations, will not only not make a contribution to resolving the situation in Ukraine, but rather will increase risks for any possibility of peaceful negotiations, which were initiated, I just want to recall, a month ago by the Republic of Belarus and personally its president, Alexander Lukashenko. So we call on you to think about, to reflect on this, and to vote against the proposed draft resolution. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. The Assembly will now take a decision on a draft resolution A/ES-11/L4 entitled Suspension of the Rights of the Membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council. Pursuant to Resolution 60/251 of 15 March 2006, the General Assembly, by a 2/3 majority of members present and voting, may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violation of human rights. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L4: Costa Rica, Guatemala, Myanmar, and San Marino. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES-11/L4, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see none. I thank you. Sorry, Tonga. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L4, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L4, entitled Suspension of the Rights of Membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 93, against, 24, abstentions, 58. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L4 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has abstained on the resolution adopted in the General Assembly today. We do so for reasons of both substance and process. Since the inception of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of innocent lives. If India has chosen any side, it is the side of peace, and it is for an immediate end to violence. We continue to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation and reiterate our call for end to all hostilities. When innocent human lives are at stake, diplomacy must prevail as the only viable option. Recent reports of civilian killings in Bucha are deeply disturbing. We have unequivocally condemned these killings and support the call for an independent investigation. The impact of the crisis has also been felt beyond the region with increasing food and energy costs, especially for many developing countries. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to the conflict. India has been at the forefront of protecting human rights, right from the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We firmly believe that all decisions should be taken fully respecting due process, as all our democratic polity and structures enjoin us to do so. This applies to international organizations as well, particularly the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste.
At the outset, I would like to thank you, Mr. President, for convening this session. Mr. President, the position we took today to vote in favor of this resolution before all of us is a manifestation of our strong solidarity with the people of Ukraine, especially the victims of this war who have been forced to shelter and have fled across the country's borders, as well as those who have lost their homes, their lives, their family members, and their own lives. Our thoughts and prayers go out to all of them and their families and friends. Mr. President, our vote today shows our clear position to uphold human rights values in all circumstances and in all cases, as the dark period of our own history has taught us enough on the high cost of being victims of war. We call for an effective ceasefire in Ukraine and urge conflict parties to continue the dialogue and negotiation to stop this war and avoid further potentially catastrophic escalation. We commend the efforts of those who have facilitated the peace talks between conflict parties and all for more diplomatic initiatives to help in finding a peaceful solution for all. All parties must ensure the safety and protection of all civilians. It is our hope that peace is reclaimed immediately and that the important work for a healthy, prosperous, and sustainable future is restored for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. President. We abstained from voting on the resolution that has been just adopted in this emergency special session, and I would like to make the following statement to explain our position. Qatar has expressed its position vis-a-vis the situation in Ukraine, which is anchored in its firm observance of the principles embedded in the international law and the United Nations Charter, including the inadmissibility of the use of force or the threat of use of force in international relations, and the importance of settling international conflicts peacefully, together with abstaining from interference in the internal affairs of countries, and to uphold the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of countries. And we have reiterated that the insurance of the safety of civilians should have the priority, and we stress the importance of upholding the international humanitarian law, together with protecting civilian infrastructure and facilities and civilians working in the medical and humanitarian fields, together with journalists, as well as facilitating the evacuation of civilians and the rapid and safe access to humanitarian aid according to the international principles of delivering humanitarian aid. And we commend the tireless efforts made by the United Nations and international humanitarian organizations to respond to the emergency humanitarian needs. And we continue to communicate with international partners to assess the humanitarian situation and to deliver the necessary aid to the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, we reiterate the call by the Secretary General to revert to the path of dialogue and negotiations and for an immediate ceasefire. We also reiterate Qatar's call for all parties to the conflict to self-restraint and to resort to diplomacy and dialogue. And Qatar will continue to harness its diplomatic efforts to reach a solution and resolution for the crisis according to the UN Charter and the international law. And we do welcome the Turkish mediation between Russia and Ukraine, and we hope that the negotiations will culminate into a peace accord between both countries. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, the Lao PDR once again reiterates its call for peaceful political and diplomatic solution to the conflict and supports all ongoing efforts and peace negotiations between the parties concerned. Likewise, we urge the international community to refrain from any action that could fuel escalation of tension. As party to 7 of the 9 core human rights treaties, Lao PDR opposes all gross and systematic violations and abuses of human rights. We are gravely concerned by the recent reports and accusations of human rights and international human rights law violations and abuses. We are of the view that such serious allegation must not be taken lightly and must be backed up by solid evidence and verified by an independent investigation mechanism of the United Nations, especially the Human Rights Council Independent International Committee inquiries. My delegation voted against the draft resolution L4 because we believe that the reports of violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law must be verified by credible, neutral, impartial, and independent assessment mechanism before any action is taken. Lao PDR is concerned by the notion that any of member states of the UN Human Rights Council can be subject to suspension and other punitive measures without due process of investigation and verification. As this issue is of paramount importance for all United Nations members, we also believe that all GA resolutions should be adopted by consensus, reflecting the spirit of equality, solidarity among UN member states. In conclusion, my delegation believes there is a dire need for more clarification through an independent mechanism that should be accepted and supported by all member states before drawing conclusion and passing judgment. We remain hopeful that the most urgent task now is to create the environment conducive for a peaceful resolution to the conflict an immediate ceasefire agreement, which will eventually lead to total cessation of hostilities. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is distressing to see the hostilities in Ukraine persist and the number of civilians and casualties continue to rise. We share the international community's deep concern regarding the devastating human rights and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And we do not take lightly reports of gross and systemic violations and abuse of human rights, including recent reports from Bucha. For these reasons, we believe the Human Rights Council must remain seized on the matter and supports the Secretary General's call for a thorough and independent investigation. We also fully support the establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry by the Human Rights Council. Mr. President, there is no question that those responsible for violations and abuse of human rights in Ukraine must be held accountable and brought to justice. The Commission, therefore, must receive full support and access needed to effectively carry out its mandate. In the meantime, we have to give a chance for the Commission to work in an objective and transparent manner and present its findings and reports. We must allow due diligence and not prejudge the work of the Commission. The General Assembly must also be prudent. It is important.
我们必须要先收到所有的事实然后采取行动。
Members. Moreover, the General Assembly's action must not create negative precedents that can undermine the credibility of this august body. It is for these reasons Indonesia abstained on Resolution L4. Mr. President, Indonesia remains steadfast in our commitment to respect and protect human rights for all. Our priority now must be to save lives and protect civilians in Ukraine. We reaffirm our call to all parties to stop the hostilities and to spare no efforts to achieve peace through dialogue and diplomacy. This is the only way we can end the suffering and senseless loss of lives in Ukraine and to prevent the increasing negative impact of the war beyond the region.